Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today is February 6th, Tuesday, and we are going to be starting off the show talking about Super Bowl opening night that took place last night. It was basically just the first of the media days. This was the one instance where both teams were going to be together for media availability at the same time. Had some Patrick Mahomes, some Travis Kelce, some Brock Purdy, all the usual suspects sort of, and ended up being actually one of the more compelling media nights in recent Super Bowl history. A lot of storylines going into this one, so I'll be giving my takeaways on all of that. Then we're going to be moving on to the NBA, talking about the 76ers. We just got an update on Joel Embiid's timetable as he had surgery earlier today. So we'll be talking about the 76ers, what they should do going forward with this season and just the direction of their franchise as a whole. Then in the third segment, we are going to be talking about the LA Clippers, who just finished off their 7-game road trip, in which they went 6-1, just won the second of their back-to-backs last night in a very entertaining, high-scoring game against the Atlanta Hawks. So just generally talking about how the Clippers stack up in the Western Conference as far as contenders. And then finally, we're going to be ending the show talking about college basketball. We had the new polls announced yesterday, and then we had a top 5 team fall last night in overtime. So we'll be talking about that game, implications on the polls, and all of these top ranked teams. Before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like and follow. It helps us out a lot. And to try and use the chat if you have any comments or questions to make this show as interactive as possible. So without further ado, getting into our first segment here, talking about Super Bowl opening night. It was a little bit of a cool spectacle. I thought that the NFL did a pretty good job. It was Bruce Buffer, the UFC announcer, sort of calling out both teams onto the field and the whole staff and just trying to make it more of a spectacle. You know, this did take place in Las Vegas, so sort of had elements of that with the UFC tie-ins, but then it was Scott Hansen, the GOAT, came out with the initial interviews sort of before everybody broke off on their own, but he had 4 guys up on the stage with him, 2 from each team. It was Patrick Mahomes, Brock Purdy, Chris Jones, and Fred Warner, so the leaders of the offenses and the defenses, and just sort of asked them some questions. It wasn't anything all too hard hitting, but it seemed like there was a lot of mutual respect from both sides. I think that obviously, when you're coming back on a Super Bowl rematch where a lot of the cores are still intact, you obviously know from the other end how good this team is, to just as much as all the work you put in to get back to this place, they did so as well. That sort of ties into a theme that I thought came with some of Patrick Mahomes' comments, but it was interesting just even from the jump in that first Scott Hansen interview. Yes, this is taking place in Las Vegas, so more so on the West Coast than the Midwest, but a lot of boos coming for the Kansas City Chiefs players, which is almost the stamp of approval, I feel like. And just, if you haven't seen it in just Super Bowl, the opening night anyways, just on social media as well, the amount of hate, for lack of a better word, that the Chiefs get now. And that's sort of how you know that you made it as a real, I'm not going to say full-on dynasty yet, but a dynastic team maybe, and a real competitor that sort of the entire nation hates. I'm saying this as a Patriots fan, where everybody hated the Patriots for so long because everybody loves parity, and you want to see new teams, new faces, new logos, all of that. And we're going on this Chiefs run now where for a handful of years, it has just been Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and people are almost sick of them now. And I just thought it was a little bit interesting the way that their players were getting booed, because this was also, especially sort of maybe a little bit overlapping with that end of the Patriots dynasty and now into their run here, where they were seen as this fun and up-and-coming team, and Patrick Mahomes is so electric, and you might not like his family, but Patrick Mahomes, I think the person, really hasn't given NFL fans much to complain about as far as the type of character that he's put out there. I think that, again, we're going to get into some of his comments in this, but I thought that he handled himself really well in this media day that took place yesterday. And, they've just sort of turned a little bit more heel. People get sick of all the attention that they get. Obviously, the Travis and Taylor Swift whole thing that gets sort of forced on football fans, maybe more than they would prefer to. But I think that all in all, it just goes to show the type of stature that the Chiefs have now at this point, that they are the villains. Now, getting into some of the more specific comments here, I do want to start with Patrick Mahomes, where all this time, really through the playoff run as a whole, but then as soon as they won that Ravens game, a lot of the agenda of, is Patrick Mahomes the greatest of all time, that sort of came into fruition more in the media. And obviously he was going to be asked about this come media day. And I thought that he was very mature and had the right types of responses. First off, obviously, I don't think he's the greatest of all time. I think that there needs to be more longevity with it. And that's kind of the route that Patrick Mahomes went. He could have made the argument about him being one of the most talented, most skills quarterbacks of all time. But he specifically referenced Tom Brady's 7 Super Bowls. He gave a quote, "I'm not even close to halfway yet." He obviously has 2 at this moment, looking to win his 3rd. But he told the reporters to come back in 15 years and ask him again. He said, "I'll see if I can get close to 7, but 7 seems like a long ways still." And I think that it's sort of telling just the way that Mahomes is so in sort of reality here, where it would be very easy for him to have a big head. 6 seasons as a starter, 6 AFC championships, and a couple Super Bowls to go with that. So it would be easy for him to sort of get caught up in the moment and not fully understand just how difficult making the Super Bowl consistently like that is. But we saw him have human moments this year. And again, that's when people sort of tried to jump at him and say, I didn't love the whole blaming the refs after the Bills loss anyways, but I thought that went more into the way that he was just frustrated with his receivers, with his circumstances. And now I think he is, sort of put it all in full perspective. It takes so much hard work to consistently get back to this point. And I've always had sort of a rule for myself as a sports and football fan that going into a season, I never pick the last year's Super Bowl winner to win it again, because it's only happened once in my lifetime, and it was when I was not old enough to watch, and that was with the greatest quarterback and the greatest head coach of all time, with the Patriots in the 2003-2004 season. So repeating is obviously an incredibly difficult feat in all sports, but I think it's just at a different level even in football and the NFL. So I've sort of always just stood by that rule, knowing that how difficult it is to overcome that. And now the Chiefs have a chance to and really put themselves in rarefied air from multiple historical perspectives. And Mahomes talked about that. He talked about the fact that for this, also for him, it is more about not losing than it is winning. He talked about the pain that he felt in the Super Bowl that they lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers a handful of years ago, and just the competitor in him. He just seems so hungry still. It would be so easy for him to get a little bit complacent and comfortable with his stature already, but he just still seems so hungry and so willing to put in the work and doing whatever it takes to keep winning, that I think we really do have a great face of the league. And I know that the Chiefs are so hated right now, but I think that Mahomes is just about as good of a face of the league that you can possibly have. And I know that might not be the most popular opinion right now, but I think deep down in our hearts, we know that that's the truth. So that was sort of my takeaways from Patrick Mahomes speaking. Travis Kelce, he touched on this idea of repeating as well. He said this is the Super Bowl that he wants more than he ever has before, and just about, again, wanting to put themselves into this historic standpoint of being repeat champions. And I think that it's obviously probably pretty easy to say this is the one that I want next. Tom Brady always used to say his favorite Super Bowl was the next one. But I think that there's a real fire. It was funny. Also, he was getting booed earlier in the day as well. And it was him and George Kittle together. He was getting booed by the fans that were there. And he started getting worked up a little bit in his own. He's like, I want to play right now. You guys are just firing me up right now. And I think that this is going to be I like how the Chiefs have sort of embraced this whole villain role as well. It's not that, again, they have necessarily bad characters on their team itself. It's just sort of the circumstances of the whole thing where in society, really as a whole, we build people and things up just to tear them down. They are at the tearing down stage, and they're not going down without a fight. So going to be very interesting, especially for Travis Kelce now. As old as he is, he knows that he probably doesn't have too many seasons left to accomplish this, especially at the level that he wants to perform at, and the way that he has been able to respond so well in these first few playoff games after going quiet really for a lot of the end of the regular season. So, he's fired up for this. And, I guess briefly, since we're talking about Travis Kelce, and you kind of have to talk about Taylor Swift a little bit in case anybody was curious out there, he did say that he was aware of this whole album announcement that she made the other day, and he was asked about whether or not he was going to propose to her at some point in the near future. He said he's more focused on the Super Bowl ring specifically. So that's what I got for my Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift update. On the 49ers side of things, this is where I'm really bought into, honestly. I've found myself between the Kyle Shanahan and Brock Purdy storyline. I think that he gets more flack than he should from the media a lot of the time, but I also don't necessarily fully trust him and fully love him as a quarterback, but he's done everything he's been asked to do up to this point. I mean, if it's not for an injury in the NFC Championship game last year, who knows? We could be looking at back-to-back Super Bowl appearances for Mr. Irrelevant in the 2022 draft as the last pick of the entire draft. So he's done everything he's needed to. And another guy that just seems so cool-headed right now, and I always think it's funny, not that I think that there's anything wrong with it necessarily, but you have those clips a lot of the time of NFL players and NBA players who can name every single player that was drafted ahead of them, whether it be in the NFL, all the guys that were drafted in the specific position ahead of them. Brock Purdy was asked if he could do so, and he said no, he couldn't. That's not the type of guy he is. He said, I fell last for a reason. I haven't held any grudges against other teams. It all happened how it needed to, which I think is such a mature response for someone that, again, it's not a bad thing if you do hold a little bit of that chip on your shoulder, a little bit of grudge, but he just seems so thankful for the entire experience. And maybe you and I are different. Maybe you prefer more of that competitive edge type of guy. But I think that it sort of shows a little bit that Purdy knows that he had flaws coming into the NFL, that he's not a perfect product, but it's the perfection of the process itself that has gotten them to this point, that nothing was given really. It's all been taken for him. It's all been being a part of this team and the organization. They've helped elevate him. Now it is his time to elevate them in the biggest moment. He gave another quote that was just interesting about this whole system quarterback debate that a lot of people in the media have about Brock Purdy, and a lot of people get really upset about the idea of Brock Purdy being a system QB or a game manager, I don't have the interest really to argue too heavily in that whole debate right now. And neither does Brock Purdy. He says that he doesn't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. He doesn't get worked up over it. Talked about how it takes a certain type of quarterback to be able to perfectly execute a coach's offense and the system that they want to run, and he's been able to do so. And it's interesting looking a little bit at the contrast between him and Jimmy Garoppolo. Not that Garoppolo was bad necessarily. He obviously also took them to the Super Bowl, but there's a lot of hand-holding, I felt like, with Garoppolo and that 49ers offense, and Shanahan didn't fully trust him to be the guy in the big moments. And now it seems like at least there is more faith now. It's not that anybody would necessarily say otherwise at this moment in particular. You need your quarterback to have confidence. But I thought that there was also an interesting moment in Media Day yesterday where Shanahan gave a little bit of a story about training camp in the 2022 headed to that season, where he was talking to the 49ers owner, Jed York, and York asked him about the quarterback, and Shanahan fired off. He was very frustrated at the time, but he said, "Our third guy is the best," referring to Brock Purdy over Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo, who were both ahead of him on the depth chart at that time. And he said it wasn't really his proudest moment, considering, it was a lot of frustration for him in the moment and things weren't necessarily going quite as smoothly as he wanted to. But here we are now in the Super Bowl a couple years later. So things clearly worked out. But I do think that a little bit it goes to show that he has seen this in Brock Purdy for a while. This doesn't necessarily come as a huge surprise for him coming into this moment, that Brock Purdy has been able to lead them this far in the chances that he's gotten. Final thoughts here on Super Bowl opening night. There was a little bit of news that came out prior to Media Day where the 49ers were not happy with the training conditions that they were given. They are working out at the University of Las Vegas, UNLV, and they were not happy with the quality of the field. They said it was too tough. There's this whole toughness meter thing. It's supposedly supposed to be something around 70. It was like 50. I don't know all the science behind that necessarily, but they had a lot of problems with the field conditions themselves while the Chiefs were at the new Raiders facilities. Roger Goodell spoke on it at Media Day and said that over 50 analysts or experts went into the area and deemed it good to play on. So, just a little bit of a stupid little side story that's going on. Obviously, the field conditions were a very big part of the Super Bowl last year, where the turf for the Super Bowl last year was very slippery. You had players falling, and a lot of players, specifically on the Eagles side, no surprise because they lost, came out of that game very upset about the way that the field was taken care of. And then finally, the NFL announced that they are going to be playing their first ever game in Brazil next year. The Philadelphia Eagles will be going to Brazil to kick off their season. The opponent is still to be determined, but interesting, just always the NFL looking to expand, and I'm curious to see how that goes. And, this is obviously a slow process, but I felt like the London games have sort of built up more and more excitement over the years. Maybe that's the propaganda that NFL Network and such sort of puts out there, but I am curious whether or not there is room for the NFL to grow overseas and just the sport of football as a whole. I think it would be a very cool thing. I love the sort of international push that the NBA has made in recent years, and basketball is a sport that definitely translates overseas a lot better than football does, but I think that it's been very successful. You've seen the other teams sort of stepping up to the challenge, which pushes the U.S. to work even harder, and we're going to see some stars in the U.S. Olympics for the first time in a little bit. So I'm just always interested in these overseas sort of initiatives that the American teams have pushed. And similarly, like, I'm not a soccer guy really, but the way that European soccer can have an effect on American soccer. We saw Messi and sort of the craze that created when he came over to the Miami team in the MLS. So again, it's just sort of like a political adjacent thing, I feel like. I'm not too big on politics as a whole, but I think that just sort of the diplomacy that sports can sort of bring people together all across the world is a really cool thing. So I'm curious to see, this Brazil game as a standalone, and if there can be any potential ripple effects from that being the case. We're now going to be taking a quick break, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be moving on to the NBA. We're going to be talking about the Philadelphia 76ers, who have some updates on Joel Embiid's injuries, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just wrapped up talking some NFL, some Super Bowl Media Day thoughts. Now moving on to the NBA, and actually, before we get into the 76ers and Joel Embiid, we do have a little bit of breaking news where the NBA has officially replaced the All-Stars that will not be able to participate in the game, including Joel Embiid and Julius Randle as well. It is Trae Young and Scotty Barnes. I think this is the right decision. These are the two picks that I had previously when we went over the teams as a whole last week. But, I think that they got it right. I would have selfishly, as a Celtics fan, loved seeing Kristaps Porzingis or Derek White in the All-Star game. But I think that these are the right picks. Trae Young, I don't think there's very much of an argument whatsoever, just based off of the stats that he's putting up this year, 27 and 11. And yes, an underwhelming Hawks team for sure. But just, statistically based, I think that he's playing some of his better basketball than he has of his career. I think it would have been a shame to leave him out. Scotty Barnes is a little bit more up for debate, but he's been so reliable for the Raptors. A lot of these other guys that could potentially have gotten consideration have missed a lot of games, the Porzingises, the Jimmy Butlers. So I think that they got this right, even though Scotty Barnes hasn't not really been playing his best basketball actually of the season as of late. Didn't really like what I saw in that late game collapse against the Thunder a few nights ago, but not every night can be your best. And at this point, when you're going too deep into the reserves, things can get a little bit more controversial, I feel like, as far as traditional All-Stars. But again, I have no complaints. So moving on to the segment at hand here and talking about the Philadelphia 76ers. Embiid overwent surgery, I believe it was this morning, and they said that initially it is at least 4 weeks that he's going to be out. Prior to the surgery that took place, Shams reported that it was best case scenario for the 76ers 1 to 2 months. Now this 4 weeks is when he's going to be reevaluated, so very much a very slight chance that he's actually going to be back after 4 weeks. That's just when they can sort of reassess everything. And this is a little bit tough timing. Obviously, it's never good timing to lose your star player, but the trade deadline is this week. So, this waiting 4 weeks to see whether or not he has a chance to play doesn't really make it easy on deciding what to do this week, whether or not you should push, and especially given their overall contract situation, given that they have a ton of expiring contracts. They have just 3 players under contract after this season, and all of the factors that play into this. But the 76ers last night, they fell apart in the fourth quarter in their game against the Dallas Mavericks. The Sixers playing their third game without Embiid. So Philly led after the first 2 quarters, up by 4 points, and then they were outscored 65-45 in the second half. They end up losing 118-102, and it was really their offense that was really atrocious for them. They shot just 43% from the field and under 28% from the three-point line. The 76ers may be in for these offensive struggles going forward without Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid averaging 35 points a game. That's obviously very difficult to replace on the fly. You can get a game from first-time All-Star Tyrese Maxey, who went for 51 points against the Jazz over the weekend, and it's a temporary solution, but you can't expect that out of your second guy on a night-in, night-out basis, especially a guy like Maxey, who is still young, just entering his first All-Star season, and it's just a lot to ask. And he does a lot to initiate. He did last night. It was a lot of driving, and I think that Maxey's a great player, but can he and the rest of this 76ers team keep them afloat enough to put them in the best possible position for when Joel Embiid comes back from injury? I think they can hold up fine defensively. Now, it hasn't been great in the game. They haven't had Embiid this season. I've always liked their backup center, Paul Reed, Basketball Paul. He's been a good energy guy for them. He's been very solid on the boards, grabbing rebounds for them. But it's a question of whether or not he can be the number one for them for an extended period of time. I thought that Mo Bamba gave them good minutes last night off of the bench as well, especially defensively. But there's just a lot of offensive limitations that come with really both of those guys. Reed, I think, is a little bit better. He can extend the game, extend his range, I should say, a little bit more than Bamba. But again, either one of them, they're not scoring 35 points a game, and that can't be the expectation. But somebody is going to need to step up for them in this time, and I'm just not sure whether or not they're going to be able to get that production from their big men, which sort of leads you to the question of, should they be looking to add a big man right before the trade deadline here? Should you be looking to build up the roster so that when Embiid does come back, that you can try and make a playoff run? Or is this now officially a lost season? In my opinion, I think that they should be looking ahead more so to next year. It's not that their team is bad this year. Like, I thought that they had about just as good of a chance as they have had in previous years. I thought that Maxey sort of knowing his role more with the departure of Harden and getting not really any stars for Harden in return, but at least getting a variety of different glue guys that they could put around Joel Embiid, and the way that Kelly Oubre has been playing for them this season, they could at least sort of hold up. But I still didn't have them as a top contender in the East. I thought that the Celtics were better than them. I thought that the Heat would be a scarier playoff threat. And even with all the turnover that's going on with the Bucks, I still think I probably would have gone in the direction of the Bucks over them as well. And now instead, they sort of find themselves in this weird position where they're currently the 5 seed. They're behind the Knicks and behind the Cavs as well, actually, interestingly enough. So they are in 5th place in the conference. They are 3 games ahead of the Indiana Pacers. They're 3.5 games ahead of the Orlando Magic, who hold that 7 seed, meaning the 3.5 game gap is the difference between them being a guaranteed playoff team versus being a play-in team. And to be honest, I feel like I'm a big fan of the Magic. I know they have some of their offensive struggles, but I think they can very easily sort of make up that ground and come back. Pacers haven't been playing their best basketball necessarily, but as Pascal Siakam sort of gets warmed up into it, I don't really trust the Sixers team without Joel Embiid really down the stretch of this year, which just adds a lot of questions to what should they be looking to do at the trade deadline. Ultimately, I think they're going to stay put and not really do anything. It can be difficult, the idea of telling Joel Embiid that this season is lost. You have to almost get his approval a little bit. I know there's been a little bit of friction between him and the front office in the past in terms of the talent that has been put around him in Philly. But I think that the idea of trying to rush Embiid back into a playoff run, given the fact that he's yet to really compete even 2 rounds straight without dealing with injuries as well. It's unfortunately just been the tale of his career, is dealing with all of these injuries, and now he's in a place where he's going to have to force himself back. I don't think it's a very good sign. I think they could very easily see themselves in the play-in tournament, or I guess best case sitting at like a 6 seed and having to go up against one of these better teams in their conference. I just don't think that it's going to play out well. And the way that it's all set up with the contract situation and the salary cap table that they just have so many expiring deals that I kind of feel like if you can maybe sell some of those off and try and get any sort of controllable contracts going forward, that might be the better way to go for them. Like I mentioned, only 3 players under contract past this season. That is Joel Embiid, Paul Reed, and Jaden Springer. Tyrese Maxey is a restricted free agent, so they are pretty much guaranteed to get him back after this year. But other than that, Tobias Harris, who has been a starter for them for the past handful of years, his contract is finally coming to an end. Marcus Morris, Nick Batum, Kelly Oubre, Robert Covington, DeAnthony Melton. Melton's a very good player as well. He's been dealing with injuries since mid-January, so I like him a lot. I think that he can help bring some value when you come back. So if you're trying to argue just stay afloat until Embiid comes back, I do think that Melton, who's been dealing with a back injury, when he returns for them, he can help contribute a good amount. But again, it's just to what extent is Embiid even going to be the player you need from him in order to push forward with the playoffs. So they have all these expiring guys. I mean, when you look at, first off, the Sixers as a whole, being 4-11 without Embiid so far this season, that's not a great trajectory. And now that's been a little bit more spontaneous games and missing a 2-game stretch or a 3-game stretch where you're not fully game planning your organization around having this monster scorer. And, you know, they are worse on both sides of the ball in those games. They're about 9 points per game worse offensively, while 7 points per game worse defensively in those 15 matchups that they haven't had Embiid so far this year. So you look at that and you look at sort of where this team is headed. You can probably talk yourself more into the idea of trying to sell off these options. I feel like how I view the situation with Embiid especially is the fact that He's going to be 30 years old next year. This is somebody who has dealt with countless injuries all throughout the course of his career. And you're going to be asking him to, try and come through this injury. I think that as a whole with Embiid, you are not really expecting him. And I obviously would never wish, bad health on anybody. But I feel like projecting wise, what, history would tell us is Embiid isn't going to be a player that's playing into his late 30s, his 40s, and, at least not at the level of being a number one player on a contending team. So your window is just sort of inherently shorter given all that information, and you probably only have a couple seasons left where you think that Embiid can carry the load and be a finals MVP for you. So I think that you have to keep that in mind. And I think that ultimately you kind of have to look at it that next year is going to have to be the year for you. I think that you sort of have to swallow the pill that this season isn't going to be the one. Tyrese Maxey is your second best player, and he's having an incredible all-star season. I think that you just kind of let him continue on his star development and see what it's like with him running the show for you, helping him step up in these big moments, because even without Embiid for the rest of the year, I don't think that they're falling anywhere outside of the play-in tournament. The 9 and 10 seeds are both multiple games under 500, the Chicago Bulls and the Atlanta Hawks. I don't think that the Sixers are going to full out free fall their way past the 10 seed. The Bulls and the Hawks have both been looking at potential trades to make. So I don't think that it's going to be that bad. And who knows, maybe if Embiid can miraculously come together, then maybe you can try it. I think you're better off just pushing all your chips in for next season, which, there's a couple different ways to go about that. I think that if you think that Embiid is going to, if you're Philadelphia and you think that Embiid is going to lead you to a championship, or that he can, you have to go in on next year. And that probably requires selling off a little bit. You have 3 tradable draft picks this trade deadline. You have all these expiring contracts. You might have to pay a lot. 2 guys that I talked about yesterday on the show as far as trade candidates, Alex Caruso or Bojan Bogdanovic. I know that you're maybe going to have to give up more now, considering the fact that there's still a year and a half left on the contract. I know that the timing doesn't make perfect sense, but you have all these expiring deals that are going to be nothing for you come this offseason, and you can't trade for either one of these players. I think that Caruso is made to be a starter on a championship team. I think that he's been being wasted with the Chicago Bulls. So if I am Philly, I'm potentially looking to see if I can get that done. The Bulls talked about how they want an OG Anunoby type of deal for Caruso. That sounds pretty expensive given that it was RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley, and I don't think you have that sort of on-roster talent unless you're trying to give up Jaden Springer. But I like Jaden Springer. I'd probably like to hold on to him. But again, this is sort of the thing where if you think that you can win with Embiid, you have to go all in on either this season or next year, maybe the year after that. I think that it's next year that you have to attack for. Bogdanovic and Caruso are both guys that have another year under their contract, can be controllable, and you can move on with game plan for a championship moving forward. So that's where I stand with the 76ers. We're obviously going to have to keep following what Joel Embiid ends up doing. Again, I think that the Sixers are probably going to stay put here, but if I were them, I would pick a direction, and I would specifically mark down next season as the one. This is what we have to have. Otherwise, this whole process, you can't really call it a failure because I'm sure that Philly fans have had a lot of fun during this whole Embiid experiment. But as far as trying to put together a contender, they would have failed to do so, because I think that the clock is really ticking for Embiid here, just given sort of all the external factors, which is a bummer given how talented he is, but just a little bit of the reality of the situation. So that is all we have on that for now. We're going to be taking another break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be talking about the LA Clippers and the recent success they've seen, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just wrapped up talking about the Philadelphia 76ers and where they should move on from here, given the updates on Joel Embiid's injury. Now we are going to be switching conferences here over to the Western Conference, and with the LA Clippers, who have been playing really out of their mind lately, just wrapped up a very impressive road trip. 7 games, they went 6-1. Their only loss coming to the Cleveland Cavaliers, who have been an entirely hot story in their own right in the other conference. But the Clippers have really been putting on a show lately. They are 9-1 in their last 10 games, have some impressive wins coming in that stretch. They beat the Celtics, they beat the Lakers, they beat the Thunder, they beat the Heat, and now they just finished it up last night, coming off of a back-to-back. They beat the Atlanta Hawks in a very high-scoring game, 149-144. And I think really the story about this Clippers team is just how elite their offense has been. In this game last night, they scored on 19 of their last 20 possessions. If you want to exclude the intentional fouling that the Hawks were doing down the stretch, it was 15 of their last 16 true possessions. They were just getting everything they wanted, and they weren't all easy shots. They were getting to the rim at will, which was very impactful. The Hawks didn't have their starting center, Clint Capella, so that was obviously a little bit more open, even though they got some solid minutes, I thought, from some of their big men. And Yuka Okongwu, I've always been a fan of, former lottery pick for the Hawks. And Bruno Fernando, a second-round pick a couple years ago. I actually thought that he played very well in the minutes that he was given, but the Clippers, it's just the level of their offense. They pick out mismatches. Kawhi got Trae Young on him a couple times, went to work on him, and then he hit a sidestep 3. James Harden had a step back 3 over Trae Young to give them a 10-point lead with 1:06 left in the game. The Hawks made it a little scarier down the stretch, a lack of attention for the Clippers, who, again, playing in a back-to-back, coming off of this very long road trip, sort of gave the Hawks an opportunity to come back into this one, where they missed some free throws, they gave up a couple open threes, and Trae Young had this sweet no-look pass off of the inbounds, as the inbounder, I should say, to the corner for Bogdanovic, who hit a 3, not the Bojan Bogdanovic we talked about in the last segment. This is Bogdan Bogdanovic, who also could potentially be a trade candidate as well, actually, as I'm talking about this out loud. But that 3 from Bogdanovic cut the lead down to 3 for the Clippers. But some James Harden free throws put it away, and really it didn't feel like the game was ever too much in doubt, but that was just sort of a little bit of an interesting last minute that took place there. So this officially wraps up the road trip for them. They are now up to the 3rd seed in the Western Conference after how hot they have been. And I think that this team as a whole is showing that they are just about the most complete team in the Western Conference. So I wanted to take a look at the conference as a whole and sort of see how they matched up with everybody. Because this team is really deep. They have Kawhi Leonard playing some of the most efficient basketball he has of his career. I think this has been the most impressive 82-game season that we've seen from Kawhi offensively. In 2019, during their playoff run, I thought that he took it to another level as well. But as far as regular season goes, he's never really been that guy to come in, night out. He's been one of the OGs, you could say, of load management and sort of taking it easy during the regular season. He showed up this year. I think that there's so much talent on the Clippers right now that it's sort of hard for him to put his name into that MVP ring, especially when there's guys getting as much usage, such as James Harden. But it's one of those things where he should have his name thrown into the MVP conversation. I don't think he has a great chance of winning it, but Embiid is now officially out of it, so who knows, maybe we could see him climb his way in. Never won an MVP award. I don't know, maybe I'm just trying to think of some sort of narrative stuff that can sort of go into this, because we know that sometimes that does play a factor a bit in the league award voting. So, like I mentioned, Kawhi's been incredible. Paul George not having his best season, not shooting his best, but still a very solid player. And either one of these guys, obviously Kawhi Leonard, Defensive Player of the Year in his prime, but both of these guys have been very good defenders throughout their career, but injuries have slowed them down, and just general aging has slowed them down for a good amount in their careers. And you can just see them turn it on at times. It's a matter of that consistency, and that's where we come to the conversation about the regular season, how long it is, how much they're sort of being asked to do on offense. And, their defense has been solid, the Clippers has. They are 10th in the NBA right now in defensive rating. At least in January, they were 10th in defensive rating. They're sort of turning their season around here on that side of the ball. Last night was not a good step in the right direction as far as that, but maybe some external factors going on there. And I think that you look at that team, and there's definitely a ceiling for them to be better on defense than they are. It's just a matter of sort of the buy-in, which takes me to James Harden, where there's always questions about buy-in with him. He's having an incredible year. Had there not been so much drama sort of surrounding, and the Western Conference is deep as it is, but you maybe could have made an argument for him being an all-star the way that he's sort of turned this thing around. Now, I wouldn't have had him even over some of the snubs like Fox and Sabonis really stick out to me as the main ones, but Harden probably slides in somewhere in that next range with the likes of a Brandon Ingram and Lauri Markkanen. So he's done a great job this season as far as getting the bigs involved, really working that team chemistry actually. And again, it's Harden, who chemistry isn't really his number one thing, but the way that he would stay extra after practices with the big guys trying to work on this pick and roll game, and it has seemed to help. He's helped unlock Zubac a lot. And Plumlee and Tice are also solid options coming off of the bench as well. They all sort of do similar things, and Harden utilizes them similarly. So I think that the way that Harden has sort of went about this season is a very good sign for them. It's just, when it comes to that playoffs, how locked in is he going to be? But at least for the Clippers here, I think that, Harden isn't the number one guy. He's still very high in usage and everything when it comes to being a ball handler, but if he disappears, you have the Paul Georges, you have the Kawhi Leonards that can take over the system more. And as long as they are healthy, I think that that's still a scary sight because they're a very deep team. I think that Norman Powell is one of the more underrated scorers in the league. He isn't asked to do a lot this season. He's been purely coming off of the bench for them, but he's been incredibly efficient when he gets the opportunities. Probably won't be heavily considered for Sixth Man of the Year, but just based off of, again, all the mouths to feed within that Clippers team, that he doesn't really get all the touches that, say, a Tim Hardaway Jr. has been getting. But I think you could switch Norman Powell in for Tim Hardaway Jr. and they'd be doing very similar things. Powell has been so efficient. He's shooting just 9.6 shots per game, which is the least amount that he shot since 2019, where he wasn't getting 20 minutes a game in sort of that early arc that he had in Toronto. Now he is playing more, but just on those 9.6 shots, he's shooting 49.6% from the field and 45% from three. He is shooting 55% on corner threes. A little bit interesting if you look at his shot chart, just the way that he so heavily favors that left corner, but he's automatic from it. 55% is unbelievable. So he fills his role, I just feel like, so well. And you have other guys coming off the bench, such as Russell Westbrook, who does Westbrook things. Sometimes the decision-making isn't always there. The one possession that they didn't score out of their last 20 last night was Westbrook jacking up a corner three. So, sometimes that's what you get. But you get tons of energy. You get the defensive presence, which he showed up, made some big plays for them in the playoffs last year when they faced off against the Suns, and that was him coming in on just half the season. And, he's more settled into this role coming off of the bench now. Amir Coffey, I think, has been a very good player for them as well. So, again, just how do they stack up against the rest of the West? I think that given that they're going to be fully healthy for the playoffs, because anything can change given some of the history of these guys, but as the 3 seed now, I would confidently say that they are better than the Minnesota Timberwolves. I think that the Timberwolves are sort of dealing with a handful of different problems now. The defense has been staggering a little bit for how strong it came out early in the year. Maybe that has something to do with this little pre-All-Star break slump that we see a lot of teams and players sometimes have, but hasn't had a great offense either in clutch games, where I think if the Clippers and the Timberwolves are playing in a series and it comes down to the last few possessions, I think there's just way more shot creation ability on the Clippers side. I feel good about the Clippers being a better team than the Timberwolves. The Oklahoma City Thunder, the other team ahead of them, I think this would be such an interesting matchup. I hope that we see it, just the way that all the storylines coming into it. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander used to be on the Clippers but was traded for Paul George, so he's probably looking to get some revenge. Paul George had the quote that came out a few weeks ago saying that both teams won from that trade that all went down, and a lot of people on the internet sort of clowned on him for that. But if the Clippers are able to get some sort of a championship run out of this, because keep in mind, the Clippers made that trade with Shai and all those picks to get Paul George because it essentially guaranteed that they would be getting Kawhi Leonard as well. So it was really a package deal. If they get a championship, I don't think you can really say that the Clippers lost. I think that that's just sort of a rule that I always have. If you get a championship out of it, you can't be a loser. So, I think that that would be a storyline coming into this. I think that their play styles, it's very interesting because I think that Zubac has been a very solid center for a handful of years. I think that he's looked at some of his best playing alongside Harden. So I would imagine they would probably try and use his physicality against this maybe a little bit undersized Thunder team. But these are also two teams that can both play small ball. The Clippers can throw out some of these lineups where all 5 guys on the court can be dangerous with the ball. And the Thunder, on the other hand, they didn't even play any centers in their 2 play-in tournament games last season. So it is very much possible for us to see a little bit of a small ball showdown as well. I've been saying that I think that the Thunder are a little bit Chet reliant, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that it is notable at least. So I would take the Clippers in a series against the Thunder, but I think it would be close. The Phoenix Suns, another team, I think that they're on a similar tier, but I think that they're almost just a step above roster construction-wise. Both teams that you worry a little bit about the injuries with some of their key guys, and if you are missing one of the big 3 members, you wouldn't be surprised if they fell apart in the playoffs, but I think that the Clippers are better suited with guys coming off of the bench and sort of filling those roles, and the other people in the big 3 to be able to step up and carry the workload. With the Suns, it's Kevin Durant, it's Devin Booker, it's Brad Beal. If Brad Beal is really running your team, and I don't mean to sound disrespectful or anything, Beal just had a great game the other night where he scored 43 points. He had 6 assists against his former team in the Wizards, which is fun, but it's against the Wizards, who are the 28th defense in the league. So it's not like that's a huge accomplishment. And I like their bench guys. I like Okogie. I like Keita Bates-Diop. I like Chimezie Metu. All of these other players when they're coming off of the bench. But we saw Okogie when it came to playing big minutes for them in the playoffs. Production wasn't really there. The rest of these guys, they just sort of patched together with the limited payroll they had, stealing them on minimum contracts from other teams. So I would have the Clippers winning in that series as well. A little bit of a rematch from last year would be another interesting series. And all in all, I think this is the Denver Nuggets conference to lose. I just can't really pick against them, especially we saw a little bit of a lack of care with them towards the end of the regular season last year. And now, it hasn't been dominant for them. They have a handful of big wins and everything, but they haven't been the number 1 seed very much, if at all, during the season. I don't know if they ever held it. They did get out to a hot start, I think, but really for the majority of the season, they've been sort of hovering in that, 4 or 5-ish range. I think that they are the cream of the crop team to beat. Now, they're relying a lot on their youth movement with Christian Brown and Peyton Watson. I've loved the minutes that Peyton Watson has given them this season. I think that just as a whole, it is a lot easier to incorporate some of that youth and lack of maturity when you are playing with a Nikola Jokic who just makes everything for his teammates so much easier. So I think the Nuggets are the team to beat. I think the Clippers are right on their tails, though, if they are fully healthy. So that's if I'm power ranking the Western Conference, I would have the Clippers at 2. But as far as how they're actively playing right now, if I'm picking any team to win a game tonight in the Western Conference, and maybe even in the league, it is the LA Clippers, because they have been incredible. So we are going to be taking our final break. When we come back on the other side, sticking with basketball, but going to be shifting to college basketball. So stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Entering our final segment here, we are going to be talking some college basketball. If you are new to the show here, we're starting to ramp up a little bit more college basketball as we get closer to March Madness, one of the most electric time periods in the sports calendar, in my opinion. And this season has been absolutely nuts. Just top 10. There's this whole storyline going on with top 10 seeds and their struggles with beating unranked teams on the road. They are currently sub 500 against unranked opponents if you are a top 10 team playing against an unranked opponent on the road. So it's been under 500. We had another case of that last season. I don't know what the exact statistics are as of this moment, but it's just so fascinating to watch just how deep the college basketball league is right now. And I guess also just at the top, sort of the lack of true elite powerhouses such as we've seen in the past. So starting at the top here, we had a massive weekend this past weekend as far as top teams in the country go. 4 different matchups between top 10 teams in the country. So we'll be touching a bit on those games as well as the subsequent movement in the polls because of them. Starting off with Saturday, where we had a couple of these top teams participating in these matchups. We had number 2 Purdue face off on the road against number 6 Wisconsin, and we had number 3 UNC face off against number 7 Duke. So starting with this Purdue game here, they came out on top in one of these really competitive games that we've seen in the Big Ten so far this season. They just continue to add to their resume, which is one of the best in the entire country. And then to go out and get this tough win on the road against a top 6 opponent sort of just continues to help them move along in this season. They are very likely to be a 1 seed again. Now, if you remember, they were actually the 1 seed that was upset in March Madness last year when they lost to Fairleigh Dickinson. So they are definitely hoping to redeem themselves. I think that a big part of it is sort of the surrounding pieces definitely being better, whether it's season to season improvement or bringing in a guy like Lance Jones, who has been incredible for them. He was incredible for them in this matchup against Wisconsin, scoring 20 points, plays very good defense, and this is a guy that they got in the transfer portal from Southern Illinois. So he's been awesome to watch. Braden Smith, we talked about in the last episode. He struggled with turnovers in this game against Wisconsin specifically, but also flashed a little bit more of the offensive highs he can have as far as a pure scoring perspective with Purdue. The concern with Purdue is their lack of bench scorers. They really don't get much production at all. I don't think that their bench scored a single point in this game against Wisconsin as a whole. It was something like they went 0 for 4 from the field as I sort of try and check this on the fly, but they're very starter reliant, which is, a fine thing sort of when you are talking about a team that has Zach Edey, probably the best player in the country as far as just college basketball alone stands, and you have some good supplemental is the word I'm looking for, supplemental pieces such as Braden Smith, Lance Jones, Fletcher Lawyer. But yeah, 2 points from the bench, just 0 for 4 from the field as a whole. So not much bench production for this Purdue squad at all, which is a little bit of a concern. They're not the only team in the current top 5 because things are going to change shortly with the polls, but in the current top 5, not the only team that has that issue. UNC came out and they really controlled Duke for the majority of that game on Saturday night. They rebounded from losing to a sub 500 Georgia Tech team on the road earlier in the week. Again, this narrative that is going on actively about how hard it is for these top 10 teams to win on the road. They end up falling short to Georgia Tech. It was a very disappointing game there, but they bounced back, and again, they just sort of took it to Duke. Now, this wasn't the traditional UNC win from this season. UNC has been a very elite defensive team for just the Tar Heels have been an elite defensive group for a lot of the year. Still good on offense, can still put up points, but it's been smothering other teams. Armando Bacot has been just an absolute enforcer in the interior, and Duke actually put up points on them in this one. They scored 84, which is a considerable amount considering what UNC has been able to do on that defensive side of the floor. So since we talked about them last week to this week, they've now dropped to 7th in Ken Palm's defensive rankings, but obviously still a very good unit, so nothing to overreact about. But in this game against Duke, it was specifically Armando Bacot, who was phenomenal. RJ Davis, those two are the heart and core of this UNC team, providing that seniority, that leadership. Davis didn't have the best game from the field, but he was at least had some timely shots and helped in those big moments. But Harrison Ingram was really impressive in this game. Ingram is probably their best candidate or their best prospect, I should say, for the upcoming NBA draft. He's got a 6'7" frame. He plays a little bit bigger. He played big in this game specifically with a 20-point double-double, 21 points, 13 rebounds. He shot 5 of 9 from 3. He can stretch the floor well. Does so a lot in the catch and shoot, which I think is just about as valuable as anything when you're talking about just playing into a role. It's not that he's necessarily going to lead a franchise at the next level, but I think that he can definitely be a big rotational guy, can hit the shots that he needs to, and continue building on this impressive season that he's been putting out there. Especially, he played well on defense himself in this past game, so was going to be a little bit of a test, I think, this game against Duke. And although Duke sort of pushed them a little bit with their offense, it was the UNC offense responding just as much, and that's what they can do when they need to, when the time calls. Their defense is sort of what they hang their hat on, but it goes even further than that. They can put the ball in the net when they need to, and they did in this game. So this convincing win against a rival in Duke, a top 10 opponent, sort of helped to keep them within the number 3 seed for the updated polls. And that was also because number 4, Houston, from last week, they lost to Kansas that same day on Saturday. So they dropped to number 5, while Kansas jumped up from number 8 to number 4, which I probably would have told you before this show and before last night that was a little bit aggressive. I understand, when you beat the team directly, it's hard to keep you below them, but this game took place at Kansas. The Jayhawks were underdogs at home, which probably never should have been the case. I was sort of kicking myself for not taking the Jayhawks in this game specifically, but they then come out and they beat Houston. They're feeling good about themselves, but this Big 12 that Houston just joined has been just such a force all season long, and Kansas then went to Kansas State last night, their in-state rival, and they end up losing in overtime 75-70. It was a great game, and I think that Kansas is this team I was alluding to that they really struggle with bench production. And that is something that I think is a real concern for them, because for the most part this season, it's been their four guys. It's DeJuan Harris, it is KJ Adams, it's Hunter Dickinson, and somehow blanking on this fourth name off the top of my head here, but it's been a lot of their big four guys that have carried the load for them. Kevin McCullough, obviously. I don't know how I forgot that. McCullough, another guy who could very easily see himself in the first round of the NBA draft this upcoming year. And they have recently added Johnny Furphy to their starting lineup. Furphy, a freshman for Kansas, came off the bench to begin the year and has worked his way into the starting lineup. He has been pretty impressive as of late, but last night against Kansas State was really shut down. He struggled from the field, and I think that it's just an example of how this guy is going to be the X factor for this team, because he was turning so many heads when things were going well, and it's not that you can overreact all that much to this one particular loss, but when he doesn't have it and you're pushed into these overtime minutes, you're not getting anything from the bench if you're Kansas, and these other four guys have so much experience that he sort of becomes a little bit of the wild card. How is he going to step up into these hostile environments against tough teams? Kansas State was unranked, but we know how good they can be. They made the Elite Eight last season, and I think that, he's definitely going to be tested if Kansas wants to consider themselves true competitors in this league and in the country as a whole. Because the Big 12, in my opinion, is the best conference in the country. It was last year. Had two teams in the Elite Eight. It was Kansas State, as we just mentioned, and it was Texas. They go on and they add Houston, BYU, UCF, and it was Cincinnati that they all joined the conference this year. All of them are very solid. You have Houston, who is another very likely one seed in the country, and then BYU is ranked within the top 25, currently sitting at 21. So a very talented conference. There's really no breaks for them. Kansas, their next game is against ranked Baylor, so not really going to have any time to have the schedule lighten up or anything. They are going to be tested pretty much here on out. Same with all the Big 12 teams in the country. And then finally, we had Kentucky versus Tennessee, who I mentioned on the show before. Kentucky is a very entertaining team because of the offense that they play, and because they find themselves in a lot of shootouts, because they struggle a lot on the defensive end. They are really floundering right now. They lost in overtime to Florida last week, and now a loss to Kentucky where they allowed 103 points. That's not going to do it in college basketball in regulation. CBS's Matt Norlander gave a stat that I found interesting, and that is Barnes, the head coach for the Tennessee Volunteers, is now 7-1 versus Kentucky when Kentucky is ranked within the top 10. So we're seeing this sort of rejuvenated Tennessee program. It wasn't even Dalton Connect's game on Saturday when they ended up playing and putting up as many points as they did against Tennessee. You had Ziegler, who's been big for them this year. He scores 26. And you have Josiah Jordan-James scoring 26 as well. So that defense is not going to cut it. They've been really struggling as of late, and I don't think that they're necessarily a March Madness true contender, but I will continue to be watching them because of all the NBA prospects that they have on their team, and I think that we're going to see a little bit of a free fall here, but they should be sticking around in March. They got to figure out what's going on, though. Big Z, Avicic, he finally got his eligibility just a few weeks ago, and now he's getting DNPs not even playing against a top 10 ranked opponent in Tennessee. So they have a lot of stuff that they have to figure out going forward. But we're still in early February here. There is a lot of time for them to try and figure this out. But that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We'll see you then.